Yeah. Would you like to plug your computer inside?
Also, we are live. I just am concerned if I turn it off, I will turn it off again.
Let me know. You did something that doesn't work, right?
Um, 7 to 9, I think it's a whole week. So I don't know, we do like 60, maybe I can do and then like Q&A. This is our first one, so we're on another job. And it's so I get it. I get close to 8:30.
Because what I've been trained is that you take reference so you can show you've got reference so you can get another better job. That's what I think, and I didn't get interested. Right, yeah. But now I'm thinking, yeah, okay, so it's real money at the end of the day. You can use it for the real thing. Exactly. That's why it should be why do anything else. Exactly. And especially in this kind of place, you could do that and like, okay, so you got everybody on a certain, like you getting them on a page around the critical black stuff, and then you using the money to help, them interact with organizations and create stuff that they can use in their organizational worlds or however you wanna, like, move it. You know what I'm trying to say? And it's just a matter of like telling the grant makers what they need and doing that. Again, they don't really press within, some of them have stipulations about where you know, 20% of the money you try to change it around, and you need to save what you're doing for that. Some of them don't have that, but then even that is like, okay, you can say, I can pay educators of why things. Could be a
Oh, we have came.
Okay, yeah.
We came.
Yep. Donick, we're good to go if you want to introduce, and then at like 8:30, I'm gonna give JT like 10-minute warning right before 8:30. Is that okay?
Is the light okay?
Yes. You can stand at the podium. Yes. If you stand right there, it's good.
So let me check. What's good? What's good? All right. Welcome to the first installment of our Aesthetics and Politics lecture series. This theme is Black Crime in Lynch Mob Society, put on by the School of Critical Studies. So first, I just wanted to thank. This was all a very, very last minute thing for new faculty members, so I kind of really was experimenting with everything, so I got help wherever I could find it. So people went above and beyond what they usually call to do. So I just wanted to definitely thank Karen Jogan, Erica May, Misha Mazzano, and pretty much everybody else in the School of Critical Studies for actually making this happen at all. And it is, so I'm excited to have as our first speaker JT Roane with a talk on grounded profit, Blue Jordan, thought, process, and radical writing aesthetic. JT Roane is assistant professor of Africana Studies and Geography and Andrew W. Mellon Chair in Global Racial Justice in the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice at Rutgers University. For 2023 to 2024, he is visiting scholar at the Charles Warren Center for Studies of American History at Harvard. He received his PhD in history from Columbia University, and he is a 2008 graduate of the Carter J. Wilson Institute at the University of Virginia. His book, Dark Agoras, Insurgent Black Social Life as the Politics of Place, was published in 2023 at New York University Press. Roane's short experimental film Plot received support from Clifton's Crossroads Fellowship. He also currently serves as a member of Just Harvest, Tidewater, an indigenous and black-led organization building towards food sovereignty and justice in Virginia's historical plantation regions through political and practical education. I just wanted to add, UT and I were in Columbia together, and it was a difficult experience for me at Columbia and the universities in general. So there were only a few people and few institutions that kind of were useful for me to kind of keep my mind together. And one of them was the Institute for Research in African American Studies, where I did my master's in African American Studies. And JT was frequent visitor at that spot there, so we had a lot of conversations and kind of kept me going. Since it's personally extremely useful to be especially honored to come as the first guest. So please welcome JT Roane. Thank
you all so much. I'm honored to be here. Thank you for this. Thank you to all the folks who made it possible. I want to start actually, if you all are interested, and I'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute. But this QR code goes to a zine, Black Ecology zine. Feel free to engage that, use it, circulate it, however you see fit as original art by Lisa Diamond and pieces that include poetry, short fiction, as essays that certainly use to expand the kind of questions around Black ecology, Black vulnerability, but also epistemic, interest that Black communities have articulated, theorists have articulated, questions of the environment that expanding Virginia, Southeast Louisiana, Trinidad, Jamaica, and South Africa. So again, please feel free to use that. I'm going to begin actually by showing, and I'm hoping probably showing sort of two film things today. I want to start with like this. I like you gathering stuff that's coming out of our August that's free gathering as a youth. Just to give a context, the thing that I'm thinking out of, and really sort of organizing and activities around Black Lives Matter, trying to engage in Virginia and using New York as a think about that as well. So I'll start with this and I'm not going to share written by this time of this and I'll share the longer short all of the 11 minute wow if there's something so like this. I wanted to share. So I wanted to share that so that you have sort of the visual context for the work that I'm talking through and what I want to share with you. I'm going to pour this all so that I can read my screen without having to necessarily read along with me. So I want to just dive into this discussion. And of course, I am working on the Grounded Project or June Jordan's intellectual thought and political vision. I wanted to say before I get into what I really want to say that I came to researching June Jordan in part because I was drawn in by her writing about land reform and property abolition. Although she is much better known as a radical Black feminist poet, while I was teaching my students during a postdoc year at Smith College about archival research, I happened upon her correspondence with noted political scientist Francis Fox Pippin, and that exchange included a robust conversation about land reform politics that shook up what I thought I knew about Jordan in the first place. And that drew me to Jordan's archive at the Schlesinger Library at the Radcliffe at Harvard, and especially to her yet unpublished draft novels or drafts of the novel Okay Now, which also went by the title as her book More Than Enough, which she began as a pamphlet how-to guide on land reform, in which she drafted fictional versions of following Knox Press's rejection of the how-to guide version, which they consider implausible or impossible for a Black feminist poet to be writing. So I've been working through the early 70s draft, an early 80s draft, and then a 1996 draft that the 96 draft she most certainly picked back up after her diagnosis with breast cancer. I don't have time to go through all the kind of details, but suffice it to say that Jordan's writing about a successful land reform project that takes place in a reimagined plantation near Louisville, Mississippi is fascinating, and its resonances and departures from the broader Black power politics around land that she was a part of and also that she critiqued as well. The draft reveals so much about her process as well as her shifting consciousness and put her as an important theorist of Black feminist ecology well before that was common to any kind of discussion. So I think that helps to give you a sense of why I am turning to Jordan. So let me jump in. This is a kind of distillation out from that project, and it includes and entangles the kind of stuff that I've showed you regarding Virginia and then Jordan's thought. So I'm really reading from Particular Lies and Places on Scale and Climate Catastrophe. A set of low-hanging clouds arch over the horizon, fracturing further the glint of the sun. They are partially reflected back in the new greens of spring, the fresh lime-colored oak and maple leaves that have emerged along the road's edge. I ride along until the back roads with which I am familiar, up past the community called Battery, give way to curves and hills that I cannot recall having encountered, despite how close I am to my born and raised community. Other than the sprinkling of a few basic Rambler-style houses and trailers set at various distances from the road, this is a near totally verdant landscape. The houses, including some sizable ones, seem adrift in an open sea of green to the passing eye, moving at the clip of the speed of driving. Closely cut lawns give way to bramble, which in turn is subsumed by a young pine forest, as Danielle's pointed words point to pine forest plantation, which as I make my way forms a checkered pattern interspersed between vast horizons of maturing wheat and young corn shoots. I'm on the way to an elder of the Rappahannock Nation's house, where along with my co-conspirator, Jay Richardson Yates, we are endeavoring to plant our organization Just Harvest inaugural mutual aid garden. I bring a bouquet of fresh flowers, a small offering to this Rappahannock elder I have never met, as gratitude for her generosity in allowing us to work their family and their ancestral land in this way. Jay began planting here in the years prior to our larger mutual aid garden to provide meaningful transfers of knowledge between her grandmother, herself, and her children. Our mutual aid garden builds on this intergenerational transfer already in motion between elder, middle generations, and youth. Jay has already broken up and covered clumps of earth and grass with fresh compost she's created from the refuse of her family's dining and lawns, as well as the soil that's in this place. As we hunch low, at first in silence, to plant tomatoes, watermelon, squash, corn, cabbage, kale, beans, okra, and peppers, as well as basil, marigolds, and some other flowers that will help to mitigate aphids, squirrels, groundhogs, and deer. The breeze carries the smell of pine, cedar, and soil. While Jay and I have been planning and working together for months after forming Just Harvest to help build local, indigenous, and Black-led food and environmental sovereignty and justice in the Tidewater of Virginia, this is the first time that we have taken a kind of direct action together, joining hands with the soil and learning about one another outside. Retrospectively, I'm struck by this moment. She is a descendant of the original stewards of this land, and I, a descendant of the people enslaved to clear those relations and to replace them with the plantation, are joining to work together. We are here together in a small way, tending to the land, alternative, alternatively to the capital L land, alternatively to its treatment as lowercase land, that is divisible, interchangeable parcels that is part of the property regime. Here, following LeByron, I mean by capital L land, the complex of relations that include forms of life not exclusive to human people, the complex biophysical processes, infrastructures, and the residues of the past as ancestral presence as well as haunting. In distinguishing here between the ancestral, I'm naming a sought-after connection to the vitality of those who survived what has passed, and haunting in the sense of a reappearing form of social violence repeating in the present. The ancestral and the haunting are commingled differently for us, but they both are here for us. They appear differently together for us in this moment. For example, Jay comments a number of times that the soil isn't great as I pull large clumps of sandy yellow dirt held together by a tangle of grass roots. This is a passing sentiment that underscores the kind of reparative work we seek to do in concert with the ecological, as it also recalls the historical displacements of the Rapanic Nation to this area, to the most marginal of their hunting grounds, with the soil that's least compatible for intensive gardening within their historically stewarded territory. I groan as I crouch, and Jay asks me if I'm okay. My audible exacerbation is a luxury not given to my ancestors, forced to toil under the threat of the lash and conditioned as property to compliance with forced extraction in the tobacco and later wheat fields that consolidated the Rappahannock's genocidal removal and the infrastructure that came to colonize this land, the plantation. I feel in my body how the strain associated with laboring, even for right relations of land or new relations of land and community, and I'm hit with a fleeting sinking feeling considering the conditioning that my ancestors experienced as disposable tools for the clearance of capitalist cultivation. As Tiffany Letabo King suggests, there are two different moments. These are two different moments, not in the sense of serial one and then the other, but compounding and sometimes clashing moments. They are constituted through differentiating forms of violence codified through race. This fiction assigns indigeneity in the Virginia context to the role of fodder for empire as subdued nature, or subsumes their genealogies into the white power structure through these kind of legitimated discourses where white Virginia families claim Pocahontas and other kinds of really nastiness, white supremacist nastiness. And of course, condemns Black communities to spatial control, forced labor, physical coercion, hunger, disposability, and a radical displaceability. As June Jordan writes in another context, there is difference and there is power, and who holds the power shall decide the meaning of the difference, end quote. In this context, in original Anglo settlement Virginia, whiteness and its legal and social architectures originating through the plantation and outlasting that form as a singular one, shape how we do and don't relate to each other, dictate that we only encounter each other through violence and effacement. Our garden represents a hybrid genealogy, combining the foods of nourishment and possibility through indigenous cultivation that, as Jay emphasizes in a public pedagogy for Just Harvest, moves pairings beyond three sisters like squash, corn, and beans, and those of the plot. Africans' partial indigenization of relations to the land and waterways here within the interstices of plantation enclosures and enduring alongside the evolution of the plantation. Our work here is the recasting of our bodily energetics outside the relations of domination, the conscription of the African descendancy as categorical slave, underwriting plantation modernity through the provision of elemental energy prior to coal or oil's ascendancy, and embodying the primordial condition of nothingness, practically in the context of slavery, as that which can continuously be disaggregated and reaggregated through ontological plasticity as the raw material of coloniality, violence, and domination, as well as reconstituting capital L lands and all the dense relations that are part of that to lowercase land as property. And of course, the consequences for this in the context of Rappahannock territory and their people being drawn into narratives of permanent vanquishing, or relatedly, the subsumption to genealogies, as I mentioned, that generate white authority by rooting whiteness in and through a sort of disturbing genealogy to Pocahontas and other figures that are very much a part of Virginia white supremacist lore. We're working therefore in an impossible structural and discursive condition where the haunting of slavery and the residual thwarting of possibility, past and intricate and unisolatable entanglement with that for a future, and the people who are not supposed to be here, but whose insistence on presence and on being meet in this moment. We are renewing relations in a way that re-signifies the difficult work of producing food, our relations of land, and the relations between our peoples. Let me be clear. We are not confronting any oil company or one of the banks that fund them, nor are we chained up to the tree plantations just down the road to demand that they cease extractive industry. We are not poised here to rid the ocean of plastics or to end petrochemical production. We are not petitioning state government or the U.S. federal administration to change their life-threatening, life-ending policies. We are not confronting pesticides and GMO use that govern the land here and silently people's lives through the unexplained sicknesses and clusters of cancer likely resulting from an endocrine disrupting barrage of chemicals of which there's absolutely no accounting, especially in the context of shallow wells, Jim Crow wells, another conversation. We are, though, as we bend and dig and plant and backfill along these roads, working to heal relations between our communities and with this place. It is small, but in my understanding, revolutionary as an action for us to work in this way, for us to work together with the land in an approach that eschews and quiets, if not totally absences, the violence of our shared and departing histories, our inherited scripting of how we got here, rather than necessarily the kind of disciplinary codification of our communal trajectories. The messiness of colonialism, as King writes, leaves none of us without blood on our hands in the ancestral and in the present senses. The violence of white supremacy so often has served as the currency between indigenous and black people, even without any white body present, even in the place where a discrete genealogy separating us into isolatable groupings is not straightforward. It is meaningful that we are learning from each other about each other's people and about how to grow and tend this land, this specific parcel, outside coercion, and with a sense of community that we're seeking to cultivate beyond just our organization. Skeptics can rightfully point to the mismatch in scale. The phenomenon bundled in the adage or the euphemism climate change is of course happening at a planetary scale and is threatened to extend even beyond the stratosphere as the ontological limit of resource and waste threatens to extend outside of the realm of the earth itself with untold catastrophic consequences. Our frame of action, working together across our shared affiliation and appreciation for this place, our healing together is on one small parcel with permission from an indigenous elder, is incommensurate with the scale of the bundle of issues inscribed in contemporary discourses as the Anthropocene. We might be dismissed as naively small or perhaps even dangerous in our flirtation with mutual aid or resilience, which are easily appropriated and can sit right alongside the domineering violence of earth stewardship through the plantation, legitimating unchecked sundering, pillaging, and expropriation, routinized through property and value that governs the earth in its current configuration, while using mutual aid and resilience can also glorify survival under these conditions without interrupting or challenging them. I hope that I can move outside this accusation, at least as a thought with you all, this accusation, the potential accusation of naivete, or maybe stupidity, or maybe wrong political action, to make a call for the intimacy of place and for capital L land at the center of our discussions and actions related to confronting the existential threat to the only verified life-sustaining planet in our cosmological neighborhood. In order to open this position that an emphasis on the local and the small forms of intracommunal and intercommunal healing is vital for the restoration of possible futures outside the tyranny of war and catastrophic violence that is our very present horizon, given what's happening in Palestine, I want to turn to June Jordan, about whom I'm working on the intellectual biography I mentioned. Foremost, there's Jordan's recursive use of phrasing that underscores the preciousness of particular lives and places, that in the course of her life and writing expanded out from a consideration of Black urban residents to include, especially following her move from New York to Berkeley, California, indigenous people, Blackened populations across the globe, including Palestinians, Nicaraguans, and those forced to live the brutality of apartheid in South Africa, as well as eventually the forest and non-human forms of life. Jordan's repetition of this kind of a similar phrasing around individual particular lives as part of her consistent political vision underscores particularity in the context in which racial categorization and corresponding designations of place, from the scale of neighborhoods to the relations of neo-colonialism between the West and the rest, facilitate the smooth operation of extraction and death by replicating and extending the conditioning of an originally anti-Black fungibility associated through chattelization and the plantation and genocidal, ecocidal, anti-indigenous logics out to the wider Blackened world. For Jordan, a corollary to the ethical imperative to protect each particular life extending from anti-apartheid leader Nelson Mandela to the individual trees in a redwood forest grove in Northern California was the related imperative to, quote, mourn the loss of every possible joyous life. This phrase emphasizes, along with the other one I mentioned, the elongated recollection of eclipsed life predicated on senseless death of a woman that she just named in one of her essays as Sarah. Sarah's death, Jordan considered senseless, and in describing it, she refused the euphemism accident, bringing to view the wider conditions that led to this woman's collision with a car and the brain hemorrhage that killed her, right? Within the kind of context of the anti-Black disposability that is conditioned through infrastructures and by the kind of underlying anti-Black grammatical inflection of place that is really the kind of antithesis of a living geography. Mourning in specific, taken alongside the act of protecting individual lives, invoke an accounting that exceeds the limits of the sociological register of life through morbidity, death, reproduction, labor, etc., and scales of social coherence produced through various forms of racial data within that kind of discourse. There's something unique in this kind of exacting precision to account for each and every, not simply in globular aggregate, but in elaborated particularity, the imperative of the poet and of the form of poetics moving outside and beyond causal and other forms of narrativity that are associated with the sociological and other forms that I mentioned. It's not that the particular has not been part of the arsenal of the descriptive acts condemning Black people to violence and subjection, the recognized individuality enacted through punishment under slavery, and especially in its aftermath, as Saidiya Hartman's Scenes of Subjection underscores. Black people in particular reside under the sign of the flesh, marked by histories of the limit of life-ending violence that adheres from the conditioning as property and subject to the ultimate will of mastery, as Denise Ferreira da Silva underscores, very much vital from slavery and the plantation into the proliferation of police murders and death in our contemporary world. Jordan's insistence here is about the right to particularity and collectivity as mutually reinforcing conditions of possibility for living. This is not a relinquishing of meaningful scale at the larger aggregate conditioning associated with infrastructures and the more distal forms of harm they induce. This is the use of the particular and the particularity of living, especially in her context, a Black woman's life, the specific vulnerabilities induced by hypervisibility, the demarcation of alterity, the harm of various pasts held within the social architectonics of place, and the ultimate disposability these conditions created for the specifically killed. This joins a life-giving program of transformation in Jordan's thought and writing through what might be possible if the destruction of property was enacted. Jordan's call for attention to particularity and specificity of living and dying encompassed an explicit rejection of American individualism, manifesting for her in the infrastructures of homogenizing suburban space and the emphatic insistence of an understanding of everyone as unique or special that practically eroded the development of forms of collective consciousness required for the securing of life outside of a horizon of war and ecocide. Jordan embraced the conscientious exhumation of, quote, earlier systems of extended kinship that could be reworked, quote, into something suitable for the 21st century, which he held as the basis of a transformed society. Quote, beginning with the given, the physically familiar and comfortable family we discover as our own, we will have to cultivate the courage enough to reach for and then to embrace the unexpected, the uncontrollable, the completely unfamiliar kinsmen and women who must either become our comrades or our enemies as we work to preserve the species, she wrote. Jordan's thought suggests a resource for thinking through the ways that a life-sustaining alternative planetary organization comes to a deep recreation of place at the scale of what is knowable across scales of communal, quotidian traversal and making in our doing, that in relation to other scales of community outside that in relation to higher scales of community outside the tyrannical configuration of the modern nation state form, which legitimates itself through the right to render disposable and to kill in the biopolitical, necropolitical nexus. Localism, let me remark, is not immune from violence. It can devolve into particularity that in turn justifies violent exclusion, cultivate and further intensify conflict, violence, resource mongering, and war. But local is not always exclusion, and I believe that Black radical tradition, the Black radical tradition, and especially the Black feminist radical tradition that I'm drawing on, has a specific history of inquiry related to questions of how you think about scale in ways that are meaningful to both the local and the kind of global. Jordan opened her August 1990 contribution to the progressive in the presence of giants was the title, with the year 1963, with the imagery of Martin Luther King Jr.'s oration at the National Mall, the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, and the resultant deaths of 3 Black girls, as well as the South African regime's arrest of Nelson Mandela, met by Winnie Mandela's, quote, harrowing and militant vigil. Using a break characteristic of the emphasis underscored through her poetic writing, the paragraph that juxtaposed these iconic images, Jordan states, quote, almost nobody was thinking about trees. After the timing of the essay toggles between trees as evidence that, quote, some things take time, and the quick clip of violence that can immediately sequester or murder, which she describes as fast and as, quote, coming like a tornado. The central anecdote around which the essay develops is the bombing of Judy Bari and Darrell Cherney, members of Earth First, an environmental organizations that sought to protect the redwood forests of Northern California from logging companies. Jordan then analogized what the media dubbed, quote, Redwood Summer, and the actions of, quote, these workers dedicated to survival of trees and hence to a life-supporting environment for all of us, with the Freedom Summer of 1964, with the gathering of young people in Mississippi in that context. For Jordan, the violence against Bowery and Cherney illustrated the ways that their attackers drew on the playbook of America's penchant for racist violence, quote, imitating the racist savagery that has haunted Afro-American existence, a virulent enmity that will also require dauntless legislative as well as direct attack before it will subside and become anything other than usual unmitigated abuse, end quote. Here, Jordan's analysis underscores the shared roots and routes of anti-Black violence, political repression, and ecocidal destruction. Following another break affected through the repetition, some things take time, Jordan recollects that, quote, before moving west to California, she had never seen redwood trees and certainly had not thought to write about trees of any kind for any reason, end quote. She admitted that in the time, her, quote, notion of political urgencies did not encompass the preservation of things as against human beings. Despite her self-noted lack of environmental consciousness, which I disrupt some by as an intellectual biographer, because I'm like, it was there in the 70s, but it shifts. She noted having an experience with a friend in Tilden Park in Berkeley around, quote, an ancient black oak tree, from which she noted an unease with her friend's certitude that the tree should perish if the displacement superseded, quote, the needs of nearby Berkeley residents. Jordan's unease stemmed from a lack of clarity about whether her, quote, own interests should easily supersede the living requirements of the amazing wild thing that arched and whirled and rooted down all at once, so close to where I stood, breathing clean air. And if you are familiar with posthumanism, it's like Jordan is saying this like 91. Yeah, anyway, Jordan then picks up in time after she moved to California and developed her explicit environmental consciousness, toggling her consciousness for a shared concern for Nelson Mandela's well-being and the Redwood Forest. And this, I should know this right as Nelson Mandela is coming out of prison. Quote, and I am writing these words less than 20 minutes away from that old oak tree, and tonight my mind moves from anxiety about the safety and good health of Nelson Mandela to the safety of our common environment, and hence to the safety of trees, end quote. Jordan noted that in the presence of Mandela and, quote, inside the grove of redwood trees, she felt a shared sense of, quote, serenity as something earned, something integral to the accomplishment of freedom. The next two breaking lines, imaging this with her standing and feeling, quote, in the presence of Mandela and inside the grove of the redwoods. She then moved to the aftermath of the bombing of Bowery and Cherney, which drew her to the Western as journalist, which we could talk about. She often like worked the beat as she's also writing at these other time skills, fiction, poetry, essays. She's also considers herself a journalist and just goes out and covers stuff. So after the bombing, after the murder of these two environmental activists, she goes to the western offices of Georgia Pacific, the logging company, the primary extractors of redwoods, where she saw a, quote, museum exhibit or sportsman trophy of some sorts, documented through a preserved cross-section, the largest redwood tree known to have grown in Mendocino County, end quote. This tree, which had been cleared in April 1943 with a diameter at its base of 22 feet, invoked, quote, an appalling memorial for Jordan, quote, the images of black men lynched and images of Native Americans massacred, which overtook her and made it nearly impossible to maintain her stand in balance. So I'm really fascinated here by 91, 92. Jordan is saying that this cross-section of the redwood tree is equivalent to images of anti-indigenous genocide and a lynching. She says those are resonant, those are similar, those are shared epistemological and other kinds of roots. In this context, Jordan understood deforestation as a rapacious force that threatened all life. Quote, deforestation is uninhibited, greed-motivated, head-hunting Western style. And the hunters and the children of the hunters will not escape the meaning of the death of the redwood trees, end quote. In her January 1992 essay for The Progressive, Jordan documented and implored her readers to not forget the victims of the Great East Bay firestorm. an intensive heat event accompanied by the burning of 3 square miles of area around Berkeley. Jordan recalled that experience of becoming aware of the fire through her body's visceral reaction to going outside that she shared with her dog, who refused to go out into the heat, and suddenly strange atmospheric change. After the feeling that perhaps they were about to experience an earthquake arose in her, Jordan heard the screams of her neighbors, who drew her attention to the billowing smoke and ash that defined the horizon from the perspective of her front yard. In the chaos that ensued from the sudden ignition of a quote wall of fire, consuming and silencing everything, including the people in its path, Jordan documented the incapacity of the media and the state to marshal an adequate response to these entities, quote, scrambling with amateur maps and lunatic bulletins of information that prove contradictory. Quote, if you live there, evacuate. Don't drive, don't use the telephone, close the windows, close the doors, stay inside, please evacuate. These are the numbers to call for help. Please do not use the telephone, please stay off the road, end quote. As her house began to fill with friends whose lives and homes were threatened by the glowing inferno, Jordan ventured out to view, again as journalist for herself, the growing damage caused by the flames. She was struck by the, quote, rapid fire-lit decomposition of trees, the choking smoke-filled air, and the sounds heard across a distance of everything succumbing to the scorching 50-mile-per-hour winds. Despite the fire's consumption of lives, indiscriminate of the cost of a home, the destruction further inflamed the social violence underlying the patterning of the fire as, quote, some numbers began to monopolize media attention. $600,000 homes or $2 million homes at the expense of an understanding that, quote, half the households lost to the fire had incomes less than $35,000, which never made it to the headlines. This media, as well as public officials' disavowal of acknowledging that the poor had suffered and died the same flames, exposed the violent infrastructures constituted through property dispossession and inequality. Some people were not worthy of mention because they did not control significant financial resources or own their own homes. This was joined with the callousness demonstrated to those already dehoused previous to the fires compared with those newly displaced. While the former, quote, might be given a can of Coca-Cola and told to beat it, the new homeless received free counseling and hot food and fresh salad stuffs and treatment for shock and soap and showers and a limited use of a phone, end quote. Property and access to the claims, particularly of home ownership and whiteness in the wake of the catastrophic, structured who would and could be remembered, and the calculation of loss conflating the living of lives with the guarantee of state-sanctioned possession in the form of valuable property. For Jordan, this catastrophe invoked the violent subjugation and re-territorialization of California from indigenous territory and Mexican land through Anglo settlement. The disaster exposed the violent history that belied, quote, California calm as a kind of day-to-day euphemism for the state's violent territorial consolidation and ongoing relations of dispossessive action. Jordan's intimacy to individuality and particularity, alongside an intimacy with her engagement between these large-scale historical geographic processes of violence, including genocide, ecocide, and just day-to-day property, as well as slavery and all these other histories, and her shared esteem for, a range of things and people, from individual trees to newly freed Nelson Mandela, as well as the various other threads that come through in my engagement with her late political essays and what I'm giving you today, index a critical formulation of Black ecological thinking in Jordan's keen engagement. I want to revert back now to talking through Virginia to close out this, and if there's time, I'll share the other 11-minute short. We gather again at the Mutual Aid Garden, now fully in bloom and alive with bees and other pollinators. Jay has gathered about 100 pounds of zucchini, kale, lettuce, okra, and basil for our first distribution. We contemplate washing it before we begin making deliveries. In conversation with one of our other Just Harvest collaborators, Reverend Cornelius Holmes, we decide that given the heat of the day, it's best to deliver it as is and let people know that it's freshly cut and that they should thoroughly rinse and dry it prior to preparing it. After he pulls up, Reverend Holmes tells us that we are very close, quote, as the crow flies in Virginianese, to his family farm just over another county border along these same winding back roads. My partner and I decided to follow Reverend Holmes to his farm, his ancestral farm, where we meet and chat briefly with his cousins, one of whom is the primary worker of this land, and the other who runs a horse farm on an adjoining parcel. These cousins, all retired workers from various state and federal agencies, have returned to their ancestral land in the heart of Upper King Queen County, Virginia, not to look out over it passively during their years of rest, but rather to continue working it, which is a lot. I'm not sure if I, get to a thing called retirement that I'm be going and being a full-time farmer, but they have decided that. I asked them how they came into farming, and they disclosed that it was always an organic part of who they are. From what I recall them saying in our brief conversation, they were young. When they were young, their fathers had aided their grandfather who had worked this land, and they were also brought into the fold of cultivating this land as youth. When his father took up the responsibility of farming here, the cousin who was the primary farmer says that he had continued to return every weekend from his life away in D.C. in the metro, about 2 hours away, to tend to the land and to provide additional hands for the work. Now that they have all retired, these cousins continue to work their grandfather's land. Given their ages and the generational depth that they had explained in response to my curiosity, their grandfather and their father held this land against the great loss of land that began with the permanent collapse in agricultural prices in the 1920s, preceding the collapse of the stock market in 1929 and the Great Depression. This is a remarkable retention given the narrowing window of Black holding in this area and around the U.S. in general since 1920 was the peak of Black land ownership. The abundance of their holding, the fields of ripening squash and zucchini, and especially the freshly sown sweet potatoes that the cousins point to, make me at once proud and wash over me a profound and unmitigated sadness. I feel a deep sense of loss for what our communities must have been like when Black people held 20 or 30 or 40 acre parcels, could feed ourselves, and use the excess to support churches, schools, and other communal institutions that provide the basis of a partial sovereignty, partially sovereign lives in the uncertain zone between emancipation and the collapse of these worlds sealed by the inauguration of the New Deal and its dissolution of a fleeting Black possibility for autonomous rural lives in this part of Virginia. Let me be clear, I'm not romanticizing Jim Crow so much as I'm naming that the New Deal was an extension of Jim Crow and its federalization. And also lamenting the dissolving power of large state projects that refuse to attend to the specificity of local lives and modes of being at the scale of aggregate collectives, especially through the state. I could pause here and really emphasize and draw out the parallels, conditioning this easily anticipatable with the marshaling of the rhetoric of the New Deal and the formulation Green New Deal. But I hope that some of the emphasis on individual particular lives and dying will already have answered this. And just to say a little bit about what that means, the Green New Deal means for this community, it means nothing different. In fact, it's meaning another enclosure on top of the plantation enclosure. Because, for example, we're at a place where most of the land is used to grow grains for the major chicken feed operations that extend from the western part of Virginia up into Pennsylvania, and currently the plantation forests that Danielle was talking about have been organized in terms of paper production, and yet the Green Horizon reestablishes the end for those as biofuels, and it means and in fact, now it means multinational corporations are buying up old plantation land and reconstituting a new level of unapproachable power in terms of the consolidation of property. We head back across yet more unfamiliar back roads to Tappahannock to begin the distribution, and I'm quite nervous. As much as I'm operating under an understanding of the radical potential as an opening, at least for mutual aid center and food in building transformative relations in our community. I also know the ways, and the folks who were at the earlier conversation know the ways that coercion through the threat of starvation and violence for stolen food has organized the de facto sumptuary laws of Virginia's Tidewater, emphasizing to everyone that only those who labor should eat, and that food without a price tag or the cover of relationality marked through family is suspect. I start by delivering squash from that insight, squash and kale, to my aunt, for whom I've already arranged to make a first stop. I then move to my great aunt, who is just down the great gravel lane of the trailer park from my aunt, the first aunt. After I sit with her for a few minutes to catch up, I'm strengthened in my resolve to contact those who I've never met or don't know recently, to see if they're interested in taking some of the vegetables. We emphasize, of course, that the food is free and that we don't really want anything, which is hard for many people to believe, except for folks to look out for the upcoming gathering that you've seen a video about, around environmental and food justice that happened in August after all this. As a few are hesitant. One white man flatly refuses, turning his face up in disdain, in all likelihood, at the notion that we, as Black people, two Black people, might be giving him anything that's useful, and especially in this kind of context where that's, for many of them, unpermissible. One man says he can't do anything with the vegetables, but asks if he can take them to his elderly mother, who he says who he says knows how to make all these vegetables taste good, since she had grown her own garden before she moved into the trailer joining his, in order to so that he could care for her in her senior years. And that's the kind of relations and interactions that we're seeking through Just Harvest. Is how do you start talking? How do we open up that generational knowledge? So we are only beginning this process. We are planning, and we did execute, as you've seen, a late August gathering of Black and Indigenous artists, filmmakers, musicians, dancers, and scholars, and ended up having 80 rural community members join us, which is for this area quite a nice number. We hope to, and we have moved forward and getting a demonstration garden confirmed through a long negotiated process with the county, who originally offered us the dump to use for land, the old dump. I'm like, I don't think y'all get me, man. We trying to eat this food, not kill people with it. We hope to model an expanded network of reciprocity through this public-facing garden, and use local food production, preparation, eating, and sharing as a way to open up other possibilities for political transformation. This is a process without any guarantee. It does not answer large-scale climate catastrophe or the likelihood of expanding uninhabitability, linked especially in this area with desalination of wells, land subsidence, and rising seas. It's only a seed that we can plant and water. The matter of fruiting will take time, the sun, and our ongoing tending. We are starting with what is here, who we are, and how we can come together differently. We will continue to build connections beyond the local community to create the infrastructures for large-scale transformation, but first here, and then there, and then the world. Thank you. I want to, we have some time. Okay, I actually am on time. That's good. Okay, so I'm going to share some film, an 11-minute short, so for those of you who were in the earlier conversation, you'll recognize what I've already said about the ways that small-scale cultivation, I didn't plug it in yet, that might be that the ways that small-scale cultivation, after emancipation, but prior to Jim Crow's erection, built sort of institutions. Black communities use them to build institutions. And I want to just note, this film is really shaped, is very personal, but also is really shaped by experiences of loss. And I'll talk more about that following the film. Shaped by loss, but also the possibilities for these landscapes to continue to nourish otherwise possibilities.
We went there looking for all we lost. We found ourselves in war. Each time you pass a place that looks wild, remember that we danced there. The places our ancestors built are alive with all that it took for them to make and sustain. looking for all we lost, we found ourselves in war. Each time you pass a place that looks wild, remember that we danced there. The places our ancestors built are alive with all that it took for them to make and sustain them. We went there looking for all we lost. We found ourselves in war. Each time you pass a place that looks wild, remember that we danced there. The places our ancestors built are alive with all that it took for them to make and to sustain. We went there looking for all we lost. We found ourselves in a war. Each time you pass a place that looks wild, remember that we danced there. The places our ancestors built are alive with all that it took for them to make and sustain. For them to make and sustain.
My fast roll. Okay, thank you. So I'll just give a couple of seconds about some of the film. Um, totally a collective enterprise. Part of the process for me was just knowing and encountering various kind of artists that I could bring together to respond to place and all that. So, for example, my cousins curated the gathering at the graveyard that we then that my partner shot. Um, you know, we asked Johnny Mercer, who's a wonderful dance place, New York based, but Virginia born and raised, um, choreographer and dancer, to just respond to place organically unto himself. And we ended up doing a churchyard shoot, which was significant in the water shoot. Although we originally came to kind of mark an unmarked black burial site at an extant plantation. So that water scene was at the edges of that same plantation, and part of why it explains why the plantation is there in the first place, because before that creek was dammed in the 1940s, that water was navigable by flatboat from the main river to this plantation, and we got him to do. There is unused footage of him marking the site of the unmarked burial ground, and yet because they continue to cultivate that, it looks like he's just dancing in a wheat field. It wasn't that visually interesting. So playing with that, but again, his organic relationship to as someone who's familiar with these landscapes, but not necessarily born and raised in this particular one, responded as a place-based freestyle artist to come into that space and to work, and then putting that together. And then when we had an initial visual cut, or at least the kind of predominant threads, James Dargan, who's a composer for the work, just did his own thing. Of course, we picked people who we knew. I didn't want to pick anybody who wouldn't be familiar with the context. And so, of course, he's a Southern-born, churchy type of musician that knew how to do the kind of right balance of reverence in this kind of space of this work. And then he worked with Rihanna to do the vocals. I had actually had no direct interaction with her. And then a former student of mine, who was a journalism 4+1 at ASU, help with the editing. So it became it's a collective project, and more so my effort here. I mean, I did some of the shooting, but my effort here is as the curator for the various kinds of folks in this. And I want to say as well, part of the impetus for this was, I tell this story a lot, but it's funny, but it's also like serious when we're thinking about Black ecologies in place and all that, the kind of epistemes that are open to us and that are useful to us that don't necessarily match Western canonical thought about what the environment is, or rational thought, or whatever. My grandmother, who we're there to celebrate, was deathly afraid of tornadoes. Like if they mentioned that there was a storm, she shook. And this was a fierce lady. I mean, 4'11", 110 pounds, will fight anybody. Cuss everybody out if necessary. Never scared of any human that I ever saw, but was deathly afraid of these storms. And I thought, when I was, in my childish thinking as a teenager, thought it was hilarious, one. But two, thought, okay, well, just getting this sense of like these devastating storms that happen in the Midwest and transposing that onto a place where we don't get these tornadoes in that way. Surprise, surprise, the historical church where she's buried blew away a couple of years after she died. So how do we account for those kinds of knowing outside of that don't fit anywhere in terms of predominant Western thoughts about the environment or knowing or any of that? How do we address that? So, and that's why there's a metal building. This is a church that was founded in 1867. It had a historical building that was built at that time, but it's subsequently blown away. And I think also the other churchyard, with their like late 19th century. I've been trying to get them to preserve it. That's another story. Yeah, late 19th century. Sunday school building. And some of what I'm doing with all of this is pulling out the various, I think we think we know what the rural Black Southern church means in terms of political action vis-a-vis either non-action and or conservatism and or a generic canned version of civil rights histories and trajectories. And those are significant. I'm not saying that those forces, both conservative and partially liberatory, were in action in these kind of institutional spaces. But I think we often allied the complex power formation that is a rural Black church through the characterization of the singular male pastoral figure or pastor figure, or defined by sort of charismatic oratory, a certain relationship to song, and a certain embrace of patriarchy. And of course, that is true. But if you know anything about 19th century post-emancipation churches, first of all, these were radically democratic spaces. Women, children, and other people there was no singular pastor in any church until really the 1890s. And it's in response to Jim Crow's beginning and consolidation through violence and lynching and all this, that you get the charismatic figure at the center as the interlocutor between the white world and the congregation. That's a response to violence and not the original sort of structuring of these churches. And if you know anything about these churches as well, you'll know that the other forms of power remain extant, and they sometimes conflict with the pastoral power. And what I mean by that is just, in a funny sense, but it's true. If you know anything about rural Black Virginia churches, the pastor can have all he wants in terms of power in the sanctuary and the sermonic moments. And of course that, the patriarchal power being literally embodied in the steeple and all the kind of Trinity patriarchal formulation. And yet if he crossed into the Sunday school section, the kitchen ministry, he has no authority whatsoever in most of those churches. And in fact, would incur the kind of get out of here response from largely those women-led sections of the church. And indeed, the stuff like the Sunday school was a women's movement that joined the church later. They didn't emerge at the same time, and there are different power structures within the church. And also they're the kinds that are totally unsanctioned, like unbeknownst to us. And I wouldn't say this to my family probably, because they'll be like, we don't do none of that. But we're in a hoodoo circle, right? There's the other uses of the ground that is outside of the church that is a whole another enactment of power that we're literally engaged in. You see the red solo cup. There's a whole other thing that's going on that would never be sanctioned by the church, and yet it is a part of the structure of the church itself. And I think you go back to Carter G. Woodson's 1930 Rural Negro, and you get a sense of the ways that the stuff like the church calendar doesn't just facilitate conservative sermonic power. That's contested within those spaces. People go to these, large gatherings, often in August, when food is abundant to feast. That's a whole nother mode. Feeding people is a whole nother mode of power in the church. But also to find their sexual partners, to engage in activities that are not sanctioned at all, to wander off in the woods and not be worried about the sermon, to play as children in ways that are not concerned with the sermonic power. So I think I'm also trying to draw out those other forms of power. And I should say, then I'll stop, that part of the film's impetus here, or desire here, is to draw out actually a sense of this very unique sense of property that is embedded in these formations. Because I grew up with the sense, just like organically, that if I have an ancestor buried in these churches, if I approach them with the right reverence, even if I do have a red solo cup, that I could go there, even if it's not my own church, and even if I've never been inside of the church. Um, that is not the case for white churches. Not only for black people to just pop up at a white church, it would never happen in this area, but also for other white people to show up at another white church, but be like, what are you doing in the yard? So and these places are, that church was founded in 1867. Most of the churches were founded between 1867 and the early 20th century as part of an independent black cultivation practice that built them and then built schools and built a whole other kind of architecture and infrastructure for an alternative regional development schema that Jim Crow eclipsed and beat back, and lynching and all that was designed to kill. But the these churches they have so much else going on within them, and that's what I'm kind of trying to draw out. But especially, I think they're them as property, them as collectively stewarded and collectively purchased and collectively maintained property. That's unique in Virginia. Ain't nothing there. The Commons in Virginia is the courthouse where we know given what you all are talking about in class, that's not exactly the public that most black people want to deal with. The other public spaces in this area are, one of them contain the Confederate monument, still does have the pedestal for the Confederate monument. And then the river is 40 miles of, the county has 40 miles of river front land, and 40 feet of that literally is open to public. So although the water is a commons, technically everything out of English common law into American riverine doctrine makes tidal rivers and are commons, and all of the stuff that's in the water are commons. If you can't get in the water or to the water because the land is private, then it has no meaning as a commons. So I think so in this context in which as I mentioned to you, new forms of for example, Canada's second largest life insurance company, two subsidiaries removed through LLCs, these obscuring LLCs, owns now 900 acres of land in my home county. They're buying up old plantation things for this green and Scarecrow's portfolio vision for the future of this land. So I wanted to try to activate a black sense of collective place and belonging and ownership, not in the sense of like the right of exclusion and violence, but as a right of, and possibility of community and collectivity, again, in a context in which the overwhelming sense of property is to hold everybody else out of that. So I wanted to artistically engage the fact that maybe the only land that we own in any meaningful aggregate form is these church yards. And I'll just say one more thing. Johnny's Dancing, all these graveyards, that church was founded, I think, 1867. The church burial ground was founded in 1871. All the oldest of the headstones are from the 1920s. So there's also the unmarked site there, and all these graveyards, there are probably hundreds of people that no longer have any demarcation. And I think, yeah, this is, as some of these institutions are dying off because young people don't visit them, and for good reason. A lot of them are, maybe not the most progressive types of institutions, and yet there's something that will be lost if they're no longer there, for our collective sense of being, our collective sense of landed stewardship, outside of terror and property as violence. So yeah, thank you for engaging, and I'm happy to take questions and answers. I'm happy to take answers from y'all too. No, but I'm happy to answer questions based on any of what we've done or even the class earlier or whatever else. Thank you.
So we might have time for questions. Okay, so anybody? Let me, because something has been burdening me now for a while through this talking before. Um, so much of our work of survival is regenerative, is healing, and there's so much of an emphasis on that, and it's necessary in order to keep food, to repair the damages of the additional onslaught of imperialism, etc. That becomes a general sensibility and more like an instinct. But as you said, even mutual aid, even these type of works, they might not be enough to kind of stave off the oncoming onslaught of the annihilation of the global commons. Now, if we have other histories of, for example, the slave revolts, etc., um, there is elements of war in that approach to empire. And I'm wondering if it is possible at all to imagine a type of regenerative, um, ecological regenerative reading of war against empire, war against colonialism. Must we always hope and like kind of gather what is left in, after the onslaught, or can we also picture a type of violent return of the violence of ecological destruction as also regenerative as well?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think, we're not at the sort of political stage with what we're doing in Just Harvest to be fully, I guess, sort of transparent in our politics because we're moving in relation to a negotiation with public land that requires a kind of delicacy. But the goal is to fight. It's not to just grow some food and have that be the thing. But it is to say that to fight to begin and engage war in that sense with no feasible means of controlling what you eat is if there's nothing wrong with the suicide mission that can be important too. I'm not saying that doesn't have its place as well, but I think in terms of mobilizing a larger collective outside of the kind of individual action that could be the martyr, there's a need to build something in order to fight for it in the first place. And I think in this part of Virginia day to day is war, anti-black war. It is, I mean, we're literally surrounded by the majority of the land is used for outside of the small parcels that have houses or trailers or whatever on them. The overwhelming majority of the land is a tree plantation or an ongoing agricultural plantation with direct descent from the same families that owned it prior to the Civil War. Um, and I think, and yet, although the county's probably chief export has to be like grain and lumber, we don't. 40% of the children in the school system are hungry, have regular hunger events or hunger crises. Um, and then let alone the chemical warfare that we endure. Everyone is drinking because of Jim Crow infrastructures, especially black people, but also many of the white people use shallow wells. Now Virginia has in the Tidewater has grandfathered in so that like all new houses, all new structures have to be built with artesian wells because but an artesian well is like $15,000 or $20,000. So not most people can't do that, right? It's prohibitive even to buy land and try to build a little something on it because you have to outlay $20,000 to I don't even know how far an artesian well goes in terms of mitigating eventual salination, but that's the fantasy anyway. So people are drinking from shallow wells that are part of the Jim Crow infrastructure that is now being overlaid after the 1950s with the daily assault of spray. I mean, I have footage, and not that this is news to anybody, but they be spraying 10 feet from people's houses, stuff that Roundup. I mean, stuff that we know kills. And people have what part of the food justice work that we're trying to do is to begin to open up that conversation about that reality, for example. And making connections. Jay does a wonderful job of making connections between the soil's vitality and our vitality, the kind of the possibilities for that. So I think we're at this phase, for at least in my understanding, of trying to bring together some of the forces that have already been in sustaining life, to enhance those, to help extend those reciprocal exchanges, so that when it comes to a confrontation, that we can actually have that, and have not just four of us standing there saying what needs to happen, and rather have a whole collective, and I think, yeah, we're coming with something. That's the point of our mutual aid garden, is to not ask people to do stuff before we have offered something. Um, and I think right now we're at a place where, um, I was talking about in the earlier conversation, the insurgency of memory, in a place where radical forgetting and erasure is the norm. And so part of the last workshop that we did, like maybe 2 weekends ago, I went down to Virginia under the guise of, we're talking hydroponics and like playing with water, first of all, it's helpful to get people into a playful mode with all of this, because when you be like, let's go plant a garden to black and indigenous people in Virginia, it sounds like a lot like toil, that we're very familiar with, and not in a good way. So we're doing the kind of experimental play that just opens conversations. And the presentation I gave in your class, I basically gave to them over the course of the workshop through like handouts with some of the same slides. Like we were whipped and had our ears nailed to the pillory in the middle of town for hog stealing. We had opening up that conversation, but also invited people to talk about their own memories of otherwise uses of the land and all that. Because I think the medicinal uses of plant and all the plant knowledges, as we talked about earlier, that was the basis of slave revolt and rebellion and all of that in this part of Virginia, whether it's poisoning, using vines to tie up the paddy roller, the slave catcher horses, and kill paddy rollers, as they call them, or whatever it is. That insurgent ecological knowledge has been key, at least up through the 1920s and 30s, to our ability to wage any other kind of war against the colonial infrastructure. And you start talking to people and they can't tell you nothing about what it was, but they can say, my grandmother used to go out and we have fevers, and my grandmother go out in the woods and dig a root and come back and would heal us with that. And those are insurgent knowledges. My father, up through my father's generation, literally black people in this area were served by what they call the horse doctor, veterinarian. There was no physician for them. So, that's not romantic. Like that kind of stuff is not romantic or great. But what I'm saying is, that what's downloaded onto us as what we got to do to survive is also the basis of other kinds of value that are not just property and enclosure. And I think that's the ultimate wellspring of the war, and potential for success is all those other knowledges. And yeah, like if we go right now and be like, we shut this shit down and we gotta go to Walmart to get food, we're gonna die real quick. You know what I'm trying to say? So thank you for that. That's a great question, and I appreciate you, agitating and prompting that, because it is something that we always have to think about. We don't want to just slip into, generic mutual aid that just ends up being charitable, right? So thank you.
Thank you for that really deeply thoughtful talk that was operating on so many levels. So my response is probably going to be very diffuse. So I'm trying to respond on a variety of levels. But I was really struck by your discussion of scale and this question of scaling up, and when a collective endeavor gains value, and that being a question often, sort of articulated as a question of scale, like how are you going to scale it up, right? And you have, then you bring in Jordan and the discourse of Black feminism, which is a discourse around kind of revaluing, as you talked about, or transvaluing, right? To transform the value of things. So suddenly land with a little L becomes land with a big L. And a tree becomes a redwood, you know, in the way June Jordan is talking about it. And June Jordan uses all these different kind of forms of writing and approaches, sort of, she's moving through all these aesthetic registers. I think that's part of the project of Black feminism, of like, sort of revaluing the particular as you're talking about, but like, there's also a level of theorizing and sort of abstraction there too, but kind of ways to move through those different registers without kind of losing the particular. And so I was really struck, you know, in your writing, there's this very close attention to place, to histories, to the plantation as a site, to all of these sort of things that you're talking about, and then you're using these different aesthetic registers as well. And then the small, not the small film, we call it the small film, the short film, then becomes this other kind of register you're working with, which I think is really interesting because it's short and it's sort of, in a sense, episodic, and it makes an impact in relation to the other ways in which you're kind of bringing forth your vision and this experience and this politics. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about short films in your practice. That was a really long way of getting there. But that seems like a kind of form that I don't think June Jordan worked with, but she worked, you know, with all these other forms.
So she did work in film and stage and other things as well at different points. She actually did a whole film on about emancipation that was usurped by the filmmakers, and I think that pushes her out of like film because of what happens. They added this segment that she did not put in her writing and production for the film about drug use that she said destroyed, and she said take my name out of that film. Like, I don't want to be known for this, because they took what was supposed to be a filmatic text about Black power, essentially in the late 1960s, early 70s, and threw in like this kind of pathologization of Black drug users as a way of deflating the kind of power that she sought to use to film. She did use the stage, for example, in 1980. She stages a play that takes part in talking about war, and actually about Morrison. Intozaki Sean J puts on, produces in New York City, and the play essentially centers around this man, an activist, organizer, who calls for a retribution for police murders. It's like, if they kill a Black person, kill a police officer. And that then brings him into trouble. He goes into hiding, and then he comes back, and the play ends with his speech coming back, where these thousands of people have gathered in Brooklyn after police murder, and it's like it's unclear whether or not they're going to take up arms and shoot back at the police, or if the police is going to come and shoot him and all these people at this rally. So she works across. It's hard to find a genre that she doesn't work across, and that's part of my inspiration. She's part of my inspiration for thinking in all the keys. I also work in fiction myself. One key that I will never be in is the poet. I'm not a poet. I can be poetic, but there's nothing worse than bad poetry. And I recognize self-critically that that's not my ministry. But I think it's critical to work across those kinds of things in order to affect scale. And part of it is about getting to scale. And I'll just say, I thought you were going to go to a question about scale. I want to use it as an opportunity to say something about that. I think what we have been doing in terms of our sort of collective of Black ecology folks, and in conversation directly through Just Harvest and other modes with indigenous ecologies and land back kind of politics, is trying to is trying to hyper focus on the local and activate at that scale these kinds of formulations, but then to use both travel between places, not just us as academics, but also organizing artists that will come with us to affect at least regional scale in order to, at least in terms of Black Southern communities, for them to come to see themselves at the scale of an effective regional block so that gathering included folks who are working, most of them, very locally in Virginia in this community, but also folks who are nodes to Jackson and Ruraville, Mississippi, New Orleans, and North Carolina through Danielle. And the idea in this is to create cultural products that index these kind of moments we're not trying to create products that make transparent all the kinds of alternative relations that people have, because we're not trying to get in the ethnographic mode of description that renders those same communities vulnerable. Also, I should say, we have plans to extend this through colleagues and activists and organizers to Quilombo in Brazil and other kinds of relationships. And the zine, again, trying to affect, so the zine, if you look through that, has a whole section at the end that's all about Virginia and all about that kind of stuff. But we wanted to put that in conversation with what's the leading interviewers, South African organizers who their working principle is that food is free, and they just started guerrilla gardening everywhere as a part of a pedagogy to use every available inch of space in the overcrowded township to grow stuff that they had to tell people are like trying to steal it, but it's free. You don't have to steal it, because you don't have to come by night. You can actually come take it because it's part of what we're working on. So I think, I see film as a way of circling. I don't see that as the stable object that will be the relations, the alternative relations. I see it as a currency that allows for us to see differently what's possible through those relations. Even the 11-minute cut, the longer short film that I showed at the end, when I show it, it's very interesting in all Black audiences, the various kinds of responses. Northern Black folks don't have these kind of churchyards in the same amount. I mean, there are examples in Philly or other places. So their relationship with it is a little bit different. It's curious for them. Other Black Southern people are like, oh shit, I thought this was only my family that went and did this. And so you start to talk about place in that kind of way. It's an organizing tool, or it's a cultural organizing tool. It is not the end unto itself for me anyway. So thank you for that question. And also for telling me back in a very generative way, what I was doing, because that's helpful to hear sometimes. What am I doing when I get up here? So thank you.
Is there time for one more? I don't know.
I think we're scheduled till 9 and it's 8:45, so there might be some time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that presentation. So much going on. I was struck by your critique of the Green New Deal, and it made me think about the Red Nations Red Deal, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but in some ways there's resonances with thinking about different relationships to land that specifically take on an ownership question, which seems so far away from the Green New Deal. So I was thinking about that. But then I was also just really curious about the archive of June Jordan, and based on sort of the whole range of things that you're interested in, I was curious if you've come across her, any evidence of her engagement with sort of the Marx's idea about the chapter on so-called primitive accumulation. And I guess I'm thinking about this because, the 70s feminists who took that chapter up and started thinking about the ongoing question of the enclosure and how the transformation of land wasn't something that happened simply in a pre-capitalist era, and that, that process continues even into the present. And then the kind of Marxist debates about different versions of that history. So I was curious, on the one hand, if you had found June Jordan engaging with those discussions, and then also if you're kind of thinking about different ways to respond to some of the feminist readings of Marx's chapter on primitive accumulation.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like the kind of, like Federici, like other feminist Marxists, I think, primitive accumulation is not a singularity. It's an ongoing process of dispossession that, if you go with people like Federici, begins with the dispossession of land working women in the European context through discourses of witchery and prostitution, and uses that to justify their dislocation. And Federici's more recent work also saying about how that continues, even the witch part has not ceased. I think Jordan, what drew me to Jordan was Jordan has never she considers herself Black feminist left. She's never, I don't find much evidence of a direct engagement with Marx vis-a-vis like a kind of like textual specificity in that way. But the OK Now drafts are really what drew me to her. And the whole premise of the OK Now drafts are properties abolition in the context of Mississippi. And let me just back up and say, set the scene for that draft, those drafts. So she begins writing. She wins the Roane Prize for environmental design in 1970 with the support of Buckminster Fuller, and they have a weird relationship, but that's a whole other conversation. She goes to Rome for the American Academy, and she planned to write a book that was had been commissioned by Knopf based on her 1969, 1970 essay in the New York Times Magazine called Black Home Mississippi, which was celebratory, partially celebratory. It was like all this terrible ism that we know about Mississippi. She went and interviewed Fannie Lou Hamer and a number of other on the ground organizers, and was telling the good news out of Mississippi. And when the press wanted her to write a book for that, she rejected it because she immediately realized that they were taking up her positive, affirmative return to these activists that people sort of forgot after 1970 to say something about what they were ongoingly doing. Fannie Lou Hamer's Freedom Farm project that lasted until 1977, I believe it is. The press wants her to say that in a way that extends out from that to, as she says, to write about the good news out of Mississippi, that everything is better now after civil rights. She's like, oh, hell no, I'm not doing that. And so when she goes to Rome, it's actually a trip to Mykonos that strikes her and that makes her go to writing OK Now, book versus pamphlet in this draft. And what it is the contradictions. So she goes to Mykonos as a side trip from Rome. And like her second day there, she's like astounded by the fact that people are healthy and well, and that at least from her outside perspective, Mykonos is a rock that can't grow anything. She's like, there are times when the sea is turbulent, and there may be a week that there's no imported fresh produce, but people still find it to eat oranges and olive butter and bread, and that's not the full rounded meal they might eat every other day, but they're not starving. She had just come from the Mississippi Delta, where the most fertile land in the world, which, as she named it, still had the most hunger counties in the world. So it's that contradiction between this landed property regime and its particular apotheosis in the Mississippi context through racial capitalism, where Black people who are growing cotton up to their houses on the most fertile land in the world are literally still dying of malnutrition and starvation related diseases. So when she left the Rome. It's interesting because they just had the American Academy just put on a curation of her time in Rome. But I'm sure that in 1970 they did not like her because she left 6 months early to go back and write urgently this how-to guide for land reform. And the how-to guide basically goes through, and this is how her and Francis Fox Piven were in conversation and why. There, it goes through subsidies. It goes through all of the mechanisms whereby, Senator Eastman is the largest landowner and they're closing out land from production through subsidies for these mega planters who also hold political power in the state of Mississippi. And she's seeing that as an ongoing dispossessive act. She's saying that it's not just this stable old plantation ownership, it's active federal ongoing primitive accumulation that facilitates enclosure and the kind of close out of Black people from autonomy with land and food. And so by the time she gets to the 80s version of this, it's a critique of it's at once a critique of Black power land politics, like nuanced critique of Black land power politics. We only get in that 70s version the character development. So just to give some quick examples, there's Quasi, a revolutionary armed nationalist who's going to this land project. There's a Black man who, his name is slipping me, one of the main characters, who is from the Mississippi Delta, but who's moved to Atlanta and who's now going back to this land project. And originally, it's the organization comes together for the land reform project, basically based on the 1973 oil crisis. This Black politician calls it a power crisis and means it in a very limited sense. But all these other people come together and start saying the power crisis is not just about fuel, it's about all that power in general and land and property in particular. So when she gets to, so that person, for example, organically, the organization goes back and forth for a moment about whether or not they're going to confiscate an old Confederate graveyard to make this new thing, or if they're going to go to a plantation. And this character sees vis-a-vis, as we were talking about in class, the plot sees the edges of the plantation as the most viable thing. Actually, let's start encroaching on the already cultivated land and not try to go take a Confederate graveyard. That's not what we need. There are what we might consider hustlers that pop up that are going to this land reform. They're just organic, they're just displaced. Brownsville, one of the two of the people that go to the land reform, they have already committed to going to this project and joining these people, but as they're leaving their house, the deli in their Brownsville, New York, Brooklyn apartment catches on fire and burns them out anyway. They have no choice now. So she's giving you a full range of these people and one of them is a civil rights pastor from Ruralville who is who hosted all the Freedom Summer stuff fictionally, and who's at a pessimism about possibilities for that trajectory, and it's turned into this land reform because they're like, that shit voting didn't do nothing and we still hungry. So there's and all of her literature for it and even the text itself starts with the premise of property abolition. She understands property as the root cause of ecological and social crisis and economic crisis. Now, the 96 draft is very interesting. It's following her diagnosis with terminal breast cancer. So she's dying when she writes that draft. Much of the character development is similar. But one of the things that's quite distinct is she's come to a recognition by then that the 73 oil crisis was a manipulation of markets and OPEC and oil, subsidies and all this other kind of stuff that aren't necessarily about the actual end of oil. The 96 graph says, basically, yeah, they had, that this wasn't just like that crisis. This is the real crisis where one, oil is running out, but also all the fish in the ocean are dead. All the birds of the sky are dead. It's biospheric collapse that drives her in that draft. So I think her I think her understanding of primitive, she does have a working understanding of primitive accumulation that doesn't just include human, actually, it's actually a whole, like, much like the feminist understanding and an extension of that, it encloses and murders everything. So yeah, I think there is a lot to be said about her kind of engagement with, more to be said about her engagement or disavowal of certain, like, Marxist, explicit Marxist reference, while also being Black left, if that makes sense. Thank you for that great question. We only have 3 more minutes, but
I should.
oh,
Keep it.
y'all can both ask, and then I'll try my best to do a 2-minute response.
I'll be quick. I just want to thank you for celebrating everything you celebrated in your work and in this lecture. You give so much to think about. Like the politics of the local and of the deep history of the land. It's a really strong, appealing track to take when we're so oppressed by these large systemic questions of national government, international climate change, environment, all those things. I've worked in national politics, and it can be very overwhelming to try to think on those scales when the answers for your own survival are right in front of you. A lot I'm going to try to digest and put in my writing. So thank you.
Yeah.
This is like kind of messy, but you mentioned Denise Ferreira de Silva. She's going to be the winter theorist here later. And I read Unpayable Debt, which is her engagement with Octavia Butler. And for me, it is a philosophy of value, but a key engagement is the science fiction time travel piece that then she expands. Would you say you're doing a similar thing in the drafts of June Jordan's Okay Now? That thing that you said earlier that was so beautiful about like each draft is a multiple temporality, but like in a present sense. And so you're reading through time, but also like her engagement with specific sites that are the thing that changes from draft to draft.
Yeah. So, okay, thank you for both of those comments. I want to say something about scale real quick. Partially, this version of this is in direct. I was at the Institute for Advanced Study last year in the social science school, and the theme was the climate. And part of this is in response to like the overwhelming, frankly, white supremacist negation of anything that's local in this race to only say that the global is significant. And as I pointed to throughout, hopefully, to some of this, that the ways that leads to this same blind spot within the discourse that ultimately leads to certain part of the ocean is expendable, certain species life is expendable, and as Black and Indigenous people know very well that we'll be first on that chopping block of who can go. So I think I'm responding to the impulse predominantly white social scientists who only can think at that scale about the climate. If you mention anything local, you're read as not having a real understanding of climate biospheric processes. But yet, who again, when you press them, will come to the idea that certain people and certain things can still go and die, and that's fine. So thank you for that. And I think that's part of the critique of that comes out of Black ecologies is like starting from the position of who's already been expendable to think. And I think that starts to tie into your question. I've been working with, well, first of all, the Grounded Prophet title, originally, especially around when I thought it was a narrower book, I was working under the like Terraforming Mississippi America as the title. In part because she used Mississippi America as a way to talk about the nature of American capitalist hegemonic spatial organization that at once names the particularity of a place like Mississippi, but also says it's all of America in a similar move to Malcolm X and others that say everything below Canada. And we probably could just throw Canada on in there too, is Mississippi. And I think, and I was using terraforming as a way to think about not this extraterrestrial like horizon of neo space colonization that we're also very much the extension of resource and waste is being extended to the beyond the sublunar into asteroids. We already know what that is gonna mean. Nothing good, probably, right? So I was trying to use it as a way of I was trying to use this really techno-scientific and or I guess maybe futuristic kind of language but also to talk about how like to ground that in a particular relation to a specific parcel of land. And I think I backed away from the kind of terraforming because I think it took up too much space. When people hear it, what that means is Mars, right? Like that means, and I got tired of trying to explain what I was meaning by, and I didn't mean that she was meaning Mars. So I'll say something. This may not be fully answering the inquiry through Denise Ferrer da Silva's really fascinating and important theory of value that everything has labor, capacity for labor, all things labor, and therefore has a radical kind of remaking of value that's outside of human labor in a particular mode. Just to say something about drafts as a mode. Black feminists, critical theorists and lit scholars in particular, there's a number of recent things that I'm drawing on from Randy Gill Sadler, had a recent essay in Oxford American on draft films that were never produced from Tony K. Bambara and Gloria Naylor and also Carlene Ferrari's work about her eco-poetic engagement with the writer Ann Spencer, who didn't actually publish that much publicly, but constantly drafted, and who also drafted and in tandem with her gardening practice. To return to drafts, because it might sound absurd. Somebody wrote 27 books. Why do you need to go to like what they didn't publish to say what they're saying? But I think there is something about what presses would not go forward with that was a consistent kernel of her thought that we need to attend to. And also just the radical potential of returning to drafts that are never published as a means of understanding political thought and process. I've definitely strayed away from your question, but I'm going to leave it there just so I'm not taking too much of your time past the 9 o'clock mark. Thank you all so much for your very generous and rich engagement and questions and thoughts. Thank you so much.
Concludes our first lecture of the series. So please, our next one is Too Black on October 27th. I think we'll be in the same room. So for your friends, whoever can come out, because this was definitely wonderful. So thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Oh, sorry about that. Too right.